In this course, we're not covering true native development using Java for Android or Swift for iOS. So far, we've been able to build mobile apps purely using HTML5 and JavaScript technologies and have been able to test our apps in a desktop browser. However, there may be some features that are not available through HTML5 and require us to use a native plugin. Native plugins will not work in the desktop browser and can only be tested in an emulator or on a device. In addition, you should always test your app in an emulator or on a device, even if it doesn't use native plugins, as it may perform differently to the browser. Even though you won't be doing native development, to be able to build an app that can run in the emulator or device, you will need to install the native SDKs which are normally used for the full development of an application. The native SDKs for each platform are, for Android is the Android Studio, and for iOS is Xcode. Xcode will only run on an Apple Mac computer with the Mac OS X. Android runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Previously, developers would download the Android SDK, which was independent of the IDE. More recently, developers are encouraged to download the Android Studio IDE, which includes a version of the Android SDK, even if they aren't using Android Studio. There are many versions of Android, and they can be downloaded via the SDK Manager from within Android Studio. Cordova is the glue between your web-based mobile app and the hardware on the device. Ionic Cordova will automatically look for an Android Studio installation. If you are going to develop for Android, then you should download the Android Studio version for your platform from developer.android.com/studio. If you're using Ionic or Cordova, you actually don't need to run Android Studio. You only need to have it installed, and Cordova will find the Android SDK that came with Android Studio. Android Studio has been installed on the lab computers. Instructions are in the workshop for building an Android app using Ionic. Xcode is Apple's IDE for developing both Mac OS and iOS software using Swift, Objective-C, and/or C++. Xcode can be downloaded from the Mac App Store. You will need a Mac to be able to do this. For an application to run on a device or emulator, it has to go through a few steps. There are 3 basic steps. We need to prepare the code, we need to compile it, and then we need to deploy it. Prepare involves transforming the config.xml metadata to platform-specific manifest files. It copies icons and splash screens, copies plugin files for specified platforms, so that the project is ready to build with each native SDK. Compile does just that. It compiles the code for each of the designated platforms. Deploy will attempt to move the compiled application to a device or emulator of your choice. In Ionic, you can add a native platform using the following commands. So using Ionic, Cordova, prepare Android or prepare iOS will prepare the files for those particular platforms. Cordova offers us some shortcuts to this multi-step process. If we use Cordova or Ionic Cordova build, this will prepare and compile the code in one step. Cordova run will prepare, compile, and deploy on a specified platform, device, or emulator. We use the -- device for a device and a -- emulator for an emulator. Similarly, Cordova emulate will prepare, compile, and deploy to an emulator. So this is a sort of a shortcut of a shortcut, that this is really running the Cordova run -- emulator, but we only really need to then say Cordova emulate. You can add a live reload option to the run command. This will spin up your www files in a dev server so that you don't have to rebuild the entire base of your application each time, and just the files that are changing will be then loaded dynamically for you. Just a note that Android uses an emulator. So an emulator is a virtualized, fully working version of the operating system. Apple uses a simulator. So it's an application that mimics the way that the application would work in the real operating system.